Yeah.
Yep, good to go.
So great. Thank you so much. So welcome everyone to this final session of the day. We have two really interesting papers, both on media and higher education students. Because we have just two papers today, we can be a little bit more relaxed in terms of timing and also the timing of the presentations and also the question round. So in terms of order, we're going to be starting with Johan Lee, who will have 20 minutes or maybe a little bit more if you need it to speak. And then we'll have around 10 minutes of questions. And this will be followed by Anulainio, where again, you have around 20 minutes to speak and then around 10 minutes of questions. For everyone in the audience, please feel free to start entering your questions in the chat while the speakers are speaking. But if you would prefer to wait to the Q&A, that's fine too. You can just raise your hand. I think since we're a small group, you don't even have to use the raise hand function. You can just sort of physically raise your hand and I'll invite you to speak. Great. So I think we can move straight on to the speakers now. So we're going to start off with Johan Lee, who is going to be presenting a paper called How Does Self-Presentation on Social Media Affect Students' Development of Identity in Higher Education? A focus on online and offline structure and agency. So Johan, I will hand over to you now.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, very well.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Xiaohan, and I'm from the University of Southampton. It's a very pleasure to be here today to discuss on my topic. My presentation today focuses on how self-presentation on social media influence students' identity development in higher education context, with particular attention to the interplay between online and offline structures and agency. So by online, this is about social media context, and the offline is learning culture in higher education. So in this study, I see identity as a tool which can bridge the structure and agency together by examining how students navigate their identity in their learning environments, online and offline. We can examine on how the structure shapes and affect the agency. So I'll talk about this in details in the later section. Sorry, this is not working well. Okay, this is the overview of my presentation today. I will introduce the research background and rationale, which include the current research and the gaps from the literature. Then I will talk about how I understand identity and self-presentation on social media from a theoretical perspective. This is the focus of this study. And finally, I will briefly talk about the methodology I'm going to use in this research. This is ongoing research for my PhD, and I'm still doing the ethic application at this stage. So this is more of a theoretical focus. So according to the NUS Service research, there are 87 of UK university students claim that they use social media apps on a regular basis. So the data shows that using social media has become a very important experience in university students' life these days. And self-presentation is one important part of interactions on social media. Students can express themselves on different platforms by like blogs, pictures, and different videos. Students explore their role in academics and social and also cultural context through the content they choose to post and interactions they engage in. For example, they have likes and comments, and also the networking relationships they build. So social media provides a platform for students to express themselves and explore their identities. And for higher education, understand how these students' social media usage can help us to design policies and also strategies to provide them a more inclusive online context, which helps students integrate and develop identities and their belongings. So Currently, most studies draw on government self-presentation theory and content of impression management in investigating the social media and higher education context. You can show on the slides the self-presentation theory is refers to practice used to convert an impression of the self by controlling personal information to represent a preferred self-image. And impression management is also developed by the theory. So it is all of the not only conscious and also unconscious process that we use to control how others perceive us. It involves action that often cause us in a favorable light in order to achieve our goals. I'll show some related literature in the next slide. These are some examples research based on government theory. So overall, the impression management is operated through various online practice, such as opportunities to present multiple and different identities on several platforms, these social media platforms, or via different profiles on a single platform, as well as possibilities to filter the audience who can see those personal profile or publications. For example, students only show like legitimate and ideal images to potential audience on various social media platforms because they don't know who is watching. So sometimes they only present the content which makes them look like a good student. And also students have different understanding about what is good with their parents because sometimes parents are more traditional. So if the students want to show belongings to the units online, they have to post something their parents might don't like. For example, the alcohol culture in the UK. So if they post these things online, they might see actually in their peers, but their parents might don't like this. So sometimes students manage different content on different platforms or show different content to different groups of people online to be comfortable or keep their good students face. Uh, so I use the word content, but not the online identity here because I believe present themselves online does have affections on identity construction, but I don't really want to distinct the online identity and offline identity like some literature did. And this also relates to the research gap I identified, like I put it here. Received feedback and validation from others online are likely to affect clarity and judgment in choosing self-expression practice. Social approval is seen as one of the main goals for self-presentation online, which determine either identity explanation and commitment. So therefore, I believe that the process of interacting online is also the process of shaping identities. But I do not actually agree that there is an online identity distinct from the offline identity. So I use the words of offline identity here to be clear to distinct these conceptions. So although the theory of multiple identities is not uncommon, the idea that recognize multiple identities implied that there is one real identity and behind other identities, while the others are virtual. So this view does not take account of the implications between these different kinds of identities. So based on this understanding of the gap, I want to show my understanding of identity and self-presentation online. This is more of a theory base. So the first one is psychoanalysis. From the psychoanalysis perspective, identity is viewed same as self-concept or self-identity. These are some terms used in the literature, which emphasize the part of self. Like the view of Erickson, he focused on the levels of mental function. This refers to an individual's inference about themselves. This inference primarily relates to a person's personality and may also involve their understanding of abilities, social roles, and also interpersonal relationships. So this perspective gain insights into individuals' active involvement, acceptance, or resistance towards specific power structures, as opposite to being passively shaped. For example, some literature shows that students who leave university often have similar experiences with their peers, but all these similar experiences doesn't mean same emotional reactions or suffer the norms in the same way. Sorry. This is why investigating self-concepts through this psychoanalysis is very important for examining identity construction. But only psychoanalysis focus more on the agency. So for understanding the structure and power dynamic, the post-structuralist view is very useful to bring together here. So for post-structuralist, identity is shaped by social and cultural environment that is subject to discursive practice. So dispersed power relations exert influence through interactions via discourse and institutional practice. So this effectively governing identity and behavior within particular cultural context. So from this perspective, recognition is a very important part for identity construction. For example, as I put it here, Caroline and Johnson writes that while cognition, affect, and behavior are integral aspects of identity, identity is not solely determined by individuals themselves. So, in other words, a person can only develop identity when their behaviors or abilities or achievements are meaningfully acknowledged by others, or we can say significant others in the field. So this seems like the process of identity construction is subject to the positioning, compulsion, and self-regulation effect to discourse. And this process is described as producing a dualist body from a focus view. So that is why the post-structuralist idea is often criticized by many feminist researchers, because the absence of a focus on agency weakens the resistance. So some researchers criticize that this fails to consider an active participant capable of enacting this resistance. But Foucault actually have this view of technology of the self. His ethical interpretation of technology of the self in his late career explored the possibility of new forms of subjectivity. For Foucault, technology of the self permit individuals to affect by their own means or with the help of others a certain number of operations in their bodies and souls, thoughts, conduct, and way of being, so as to transform themselves in order to attain a certain status of happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or immortality. So based on this view, for example, taking notes on self to be reread, like we have diaries or writing letters to friends are all example of self techniques in practice. This kind of self-conversation makes the resilience happens and gives the opportunity to construct identities. So with the combination of psychoanalyst and post-structuralist view, especially the technology of the self, the concept of identity can bring structure and agency together, research on how structure shapes agency in a whole way, but not see identity as only in categories. But how can this relate to social media and self-presentation? Because taking notes or writing letters are very different to posting blogs on social media, because social media is not only a platform, it is a very complicated environment which have different norms on different platforms and allows different interactions from different people. Social media also allow advertising, build online communities, build communities for resistance, etc. So interact with social media also means interact with a different context online, and also algorithm. Sometimes algorithm promotes certain kinds of content, so brings a different kinds of structure. So when people interact with social media, they have to negotiate or subvert or resist from the norm. So for understanding how this practice affect identity construction, I added a few post-humanism view here. For example, as I talked about in the beginning, if we have an online identity, the online identity is shaped by the online structure, but how online identity and offline identity affect each other. This view is from Donna Haraway. She believes that technological advance have long since blurred the lines between humans and machines. She believes that the process of understanding and shaping the environment by employ a multitude instruments such as keyboards or screens, humans start to become the cyborgs, a cyborg beyond the surface meaning. So this kind of view actually made me feel very curious when I first read the sentence because it is very hard to understand how myself being a machine, but it can be easily understood with examples. For example, with my human body, I'm a human, but when I start to wear my glasses here, like, am I still a human? And sometimes when I forget to wear my glasses, I use my camera on the phone to zoom in something that I can't see clearly. So in this way, am I still a human? So it's very fun to think about this. So from the metaphor of these cyborgs, we don't need to actually distinct the human and machines. So in this way, we also don't need to distinguish the online and offline. So these are just so online social media are just different sides of environment. So this means with the combination of psychoanalyst, post-structuralist, and post-humanist theories, uh, writing or presenting online, so or we call it this self-presentation, can be understood as a process of identity practice. And this is subject to particular online contextual norms. So from this understanding to understand how students construct identity in social media context, it is important uh, not only research on the behavior, it's also important to uh, understand what are the norms in different social media platforms and how students negotiate or subvert or internalize all these kind of norms. So these are my understanding of the concept of identity in social media context. Hope that is useful. Uh, So based on the understanding of identity in my way, here are some methodology I'm going to use to investigate how students construct identities in the online structure. For investigating the identity in social media context, I used the photo elicitation interview. I put orthography here is because I was going to use online orthography in the beginning of I start my study, but I wanted to collect structured data at an individual level because everybody use social media in different ways. So not all the self-presentation online are in public platforms. So it introduced a range of ethical challenges. For example, even if I can get the permission from the participants that I can see their social media platforms or their social media contents by their phone, the friends who interact with them online can not all get the content. So in addition, in some social media platform are algorithm-driven features. So like the For You page from Facebook or Twitter. So I actually see different things with my account other than the participant's account. So by using this photo elicitation interview, uh, this not only avoids all these problems, also give me an opportunity to explore how participants respond to different platforms and construct their identities online. This approach plays also this approach plays very important role in supporting multiple sides in the field of infographic research, especially in the context of social media. And I also combined biographic interview here because the static experience offer limited insight in the ways of individuals' perspectives evolving over time and how they construct meaning from their lived experience. So this means identity is developed over time and individual interpreted meanings based on their experiences. So with the combination of biographic interview will help understand how individuals construct meaning from their past and present experiences. So with the combination of these two methods together, I can investigate identity construction through social media based on my understanding of identity and also see how students shape their identity over time. Okay, so these are the references I have used today. This is my presentation today, so hope I didn't make you sleepy by these all kinds of theories.
Thank you so much. Would you like to stop sharing your screen? Then we can all see each other a little bit better. Thank you
Okay.
so much, Johan. That was such a fascinating presentation, and your project sounds really exciting. We hope in the future years to start seeing your data and hearing about your findings. So if anyone has a question, raise your hand. I can start off. Oh, sorry. Rachel, would you like to go first?
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. And that was interesting. I was just wondering, because you talked about kind of quite general theory and how that might inform your study, but I was just also wondering how previous empirical work has informed your study, because I guess, people have looked at social media. I mean, Sasna and others too, in relation to British students, international students, influencers. So I was just wondering how kind of empirical studies have informed what you're going to do, as well as the kind of the sociological theoretical stuff that you were talking about.
Yes, I like that question because this study is actually from my PhD, so that is a broader study. I research on the computer science identity and how they construct their identity in offline and also online context. So when researching in the computer science field and also in higher education, a lot of literatures only see identity as like a category, like female in computer science, or they see like ethnicity or see themselves as international students, but all these kind of students have different experiences. So if we see identity in categories, we kind of ignore their unique different experiences and see them like a harmonized group. So if we want to understand how their experiences shape their identity in the current structure, so we have to understand identity in a very dynamic way and how they view themselves and how they react with the structural norms by their understanding of themselves. So I hope that if that answers your question.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether, there were particular empirical studies that had, specifically informed what you were doing.
Yes, because when I'm researching in the because I just started my ethical application, so I haven't got my own data. But I can see from the literature they have used different kinds of identity theories in like different views, but not much have this kind of combinations because there are new areas. For example, the psychoanalysts sometimes they feel they view they want to research on how students view themselves as a student's role, and sometimes the literature like focus on the structures, but I think it is valuable to bring these kind of things together.
Great. Yeah. So any other questions from the audience? Anu has a question.
No, it's just a simple question. Maybe you mentioned that. I'll apologize if I missed that. But in the students you want to study, are they who are the students? I'm just curious to hear about that. if you have already thought about who you want to be your participants in your study.
Because this study is this part of my whole study. So my main study is about computer science female students in higher education.
Thanks.
And
Is it like, sorry, I'm just going to ask, is it like in certain countries specifically, or is it like?
I'm going to conduct orthography research in UK.
In the UK. Okay.
Great. And I have a question as well. So you had talked about how you were thinking of using photo elicitation. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what kind of photos you're going to be, like, how are you going to be using this method?
But this is very good question, because students are actually using social media in a very complicated way. So they manage themselves on different platforms. So it's very hard to understand how they use different kind of social media and put all these interactions into one photo. So I am currently conducting a preliminary study, understand how they interact with different kind of social medias. And by using this kind of photos, I want to start with like a screenshot. But actually, the screenshot has limited all kinds of interactions into one photos. So I want to be flexible here. So in the preliminary study, I also want to research on how the students think it is useful to record all this content. So start from one screenshot, and they can also show the content or videos in the interview.
So you can kind of ask them to show you their social media and discuss it.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, well, that sounds good. And are you thinking of including people at different levels? So undergraduate, masters, and PhD computer science female students?
In this
Or...
study, I want to focus on the undergraduate, because the job rate in UK of computer science students, especially the female students, is very high. I think is the highest job rate in UK. So it's valuable to research on what kind of experience they are doing and what makes this kind of job rate.
Okay. And I can ask another question, but if anybody wants to has another question, please feel free to raise your hand. I don't want to dominate it too much. But I was wondering, you said that you wanted to look at computer science students. And I was wondering, are you interested in looking at the impact of a particular discipline on the kinds of identities people want to project or create? Why did you choose computer science? Are you interested in the kind of discipline and identity interaction?
Yes, because when I was doing the literature review, the view of identity from the computer science discipline is very limited. I think because the computer science develop very much these days, so they have to do the research in a very quick way. So sometimes they research on identity into categories and focus on how female students like view identity. And sometimes they also have a kind of concept called computer science identity. And when they view computer science identity, they are talking about if the students are interested in computer science, or if they see themselves as a future computer scientist. But when like doing the research on interesting computer science is a very, very broad word, and I don't think it is properly to understand computer science in a certain way. So that also limits students' interest in. For example, some students was interesting to the career choice from the computer science discipline, but some students just like coding, like a lot of male students like. So so that's why I think understand the computer science identity in a broader way is very valuable.
Thank you so much. So I think that brings us to the end of the Q&A session. If anyone has any further questions for Ziohan, you can feel free to put them in the chat and she can pick them up. So now we'll move on to our second and final presenter for the day, Anu Lainio, who will be presenting a paper titled Discursive Politics of Studentship representation of higher education student in the news media. So Anu, over to you. Oh, you're muted, Anu.
Right.
Yeah,
Now,
and we can see your screen well.
Perfect. That's what I was asking. Great. So, yes. So, as Sasna said, my name is Anu. I work currently as a postdoctoral researcher at University of Eastern Finland. But what I'm presenting today, I'm talking about students in the news media, is something that draws on my PhD thesis, which I did at the University of SRHE, finished last year. This is something that is a bit of a work in progress. I am aiming to draft some sort of an article out of this to basically, with the aim to illustrate what I see as the discursive politics of studentship. So if you have any comments, well, in general, I'm very welcome to hear your comments about this. I'm a bit of a concern that I might have a lot of things to say, so I will try to move on quite quickly. So basically, oops, a little bit of background. So I'm going to start with what I mean by studentship, which is kind of the essential concept in this discursive politics of studentship. So I see studentship as something that captures basically the various aspects of that can answer the question of what it means to be a contemporary student. So this relates to different roles, identities, experiences, and all conditions of being a student, which obviously can be quite different in different contexts, across different contexts. And looking at the higher education scholarship, obviously we have a large body of research that is exploring various elements and aspects of what I just mentioned as constitute this idea of studentship. I'm not going to go through these in very detail, but obviously we have a lot of research on looking at different identities and constructions of students. We have students are discussed in relation to work and employment, obviously teaching, learning, discussions related to inequalities and access to higher education and student experiences in relation to that, as well as student well-being. So we have a fairly solid body of literature that I see basically answers to the question of exploring these aspects of the studentship. However, when looking at this scholarship, it quite a lot centers around the actors within the realm of higher education, whether it's policy analysis, student experiences, views of academics, higher education staff, and so on and so forth. And although we kind of, this previous presentation touched upon also students in social media and how students might be viewed in social media, I still see that this is a rather under-researched area, the fact that how students are understood basically beyond the realm of high, which media being one of those examples, and obviously social media being, for example, another space where students are also, or this idea of studentship is also constructed. So yeah, that's something what I'm trying to kind of address here a little bit. So there are also other reasons that I think are important to highlight why to study media. So for example, these studies on mediatization of higher education policy very much highlight how media has a crucial role in shaping also higher education policies, but broadly also more educational narratives. Media can also be seen as a powerful social actor, shaping readers' perceptions, raising various concerns and expectations about public matters, for example, related to higher education and students. And it also, regardless of various aspects of digitalization and social media, remains an important source of information, particularly for people who might not have a direct contact to higher education. And thirdly, talking about this discursive power of media, it's important to acknowledge, which basically means that that media is not like just reflecting something what is out there and thought to be students, but it has this discursive power, meaning that it actively constructs legitimate subjectivities and also ideals of social agency. Which brings me to my sort of theoretical inspiration discourse theory, which is more like rather than a specific theory, it's more like a research approach, mainly based on the work or work on Ernest de Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. And then there are various other discourse theorists who have later on picked up on their work. Some of the few key points that I want to highlight here is, first of all, that all social practices are seen as discursive, which is kind of slightly different to some other discourse analysis views. So it means that discourse is not limited only to language or text, but it basically encompasses all social practices, ideologies, and power dynamics. In discourse theory, discourse is defined as web of relations. It's kind of a site for what can be called discursive struggles, which means that in those struggles, meaning is constantly negotiated and constructed. Newspapers, then, from this approach point of view, can be seen as specific sites that include complex combinations of different norms, ideas, and practices that produce, reproduce, and also transform social phenomena, such as the idea of the studentship. So just briefly about my study. As I mentioned, this is something based on my PhD work. And my PhD was based on a larger research project called Your Students that conceptualization of Asian students within across 6 European countries: Denmark, England, Germany, Ireland, Poland, and Spain. And the project focused on 4 different actors: policymakers, higher education institutions, students, and the media, which was the specific actor that I focused. So within the media strands, I collected data from 2 national newspapers from each of these 6 countries, which are listed in the box here. I included from each country either broadsheet and a tabloid paper, or 2 broadsheet papers with different political alignment. In the end, the whole data set consisted of about 1,159 articles, which I gathered over a 3-year period. I approached my data for 2 analytical methods. I first conducted systematic content analysis, that I looked at these various topics and themes, which I constructed both deductively and inductively. In the second phase, I conducted discourse analysis, where I focused on more detailed analysis of specific themes and patterns, with the focus on these discursive processes and certain underlying assumptions in the ways in which students are constructed. Now, in this presentation, I want to focus on a specific set of my findings. I will demonstrate to you 3 contradictory constructions in the news media across these countries, which I argue that trace discursive politics of studentship in the news media. So I'm going to start with the first one, which is this contradiction that students are, on one hand, constructed as entitled and demanding, and on the other hand, they're seen as incompetent and lacking academic qualities. These 2 constructions are very much sort of embedded in discourses of quality, learning and teaching, and the relationship of these. So first, looking at the entitled and demanding. In a lot of newspapers, students are described as dissatisfied to some aspect of their education and also demanding better quality. They can often be, often these demands are related to students learning the skills and competencies for future labor market, as this example in The Guardian in the top shows, which basically says that people expect the decrease to boost their prospects in the labor market. There are also other aspects of teaching and education, other aspects of quality that are expressed in the newspapers in terms of what students are demanding. For example, the Politiken example here demonstrates that students want more feedback on their assignments, and the bottom one from the Polish newspaper shows how student parliament expresses their demands for better supervisory care. So basically, this entitled and demanding student speaks to this notion of students as quality demanding service users, who often are also presented to be aware of their rights of these services or the quality that they want to have. And often this quality is understood in rather measurable terms. It can be, like as indicated here, the amount of feedback, sometimes number of teaching hours, or as the Guardian example shows, related to the future prospects. What is interesting here that the entitlement and demands portrayed here are portrayed as sort of a positive or at least neutral quality of students, which is in quite a stark contrast with the existing scholarship that tends to problematize these traits as more like consumerist, which often implies the passivity of students as learners, and also possibly distorting pedagogical relationship between students and academics. Now, the second, or the other construction here is the incompetent student lacking academic qualities. And this is very much related to the discussions about the quality of the student population, or at least certain students, which then is linked to discourses about growing size of the student population and as well as the diversity of student population. So the incompetent student in the newspapers is often described as lazy, stupid, criticized for lacking interest, skills, or intellectual capacity to study at the required level. And for example, being more interested in the screen of a mobile phone, as the Polish newspaper example here shows. The other example on the screen is from Politiken, which I think captures quite nicely the whole essence of what is in the news media talked about as the incompetent student. So here it is said that there's just one group that should never have been at university. It is stupid students who would rather have teaching that is entertaining and does not contain so many formulas and such things. If they are lazy and do not want to work, they should not be at the university. We must raise the bar for access in order not to damage those who actually belong to the university. So here, basically, the Danish example, in top of that, describing the various qualities and elements of the incompetent students, also kind of sees these students as a risk to high quality education and questioning their suitability or whether they belong to higher education at all. So there is kind of in this discourse, like this dichotomy created between the incompetent student that is described, but at the same time it was said that there are competent students who are the ones who belong and are welcomed to the university. In that sense, the competent student can be seen sort of as the opposite and the ideal student, which then would exemplify qualities such as independent, motivated, hardworking, and even somehow naturally academically able. In these discussions, the assumed decrease in the academic quality of students is implicitly and sometimes even explicitly associated with this increased diversity of student population. And there are sometimes references made to past students as being higher quality, which then can sort of imply that it is the incompetent students who are seen as the more like the new entrants, while the competent students are associated with the past quality students. So what I see here are competing student ideals, and there's a tension over who belongs to the higher education between these constructions of students as entitled and demanding and incompetent. So on one hand, we have this conforming to hegemonic neoliberal ideals of higher education within the entitled and demanding students are seen as desirable, with the higher education framed very much as these investments of future careers and students seeking that certain type of quality education. On the other hand, conforming to the traditional ideals of higher education is also desirable, which kind of embraces this image of the independent learner, which in the current literature is very much described that this ideal independent learner is inherently as masculine, Western, white, and middle class, which then could exclude many students in the era in the current mass qualification. So basically, this contradiction here highlights the coexistence of more recent neoliberal and traditional discourses of higher education in the news media, both shaping this complexity of the studentship. Now, the second contradiction I see as between the construction of students as stressed and anxious, and at the same time efficient and rational. And these stressed and anxious students, it very much relates to discussions about student well-being and mental health, which have been quite topical for some time, and particularly so after COVID, I think so. So in the newspapers, what is often described is that students are experiencing increasingly problems related to mental health, stress, anxiety, and pressure, like this headline from the Irish Independent here shows. Anxiety has overtaken depression as the greatest concern facing university students. Overall, when these problems with students' mental health are discussed, various social, political, and economic factors are attributed as reasons for these struggles. There are points about higher education reform, uncertainty about future, debt, and higher tuition fees are attributed as reasons. In these two examples, one from the German newspaper and the bottom one from the Danish newspaper, we see that both attribute this increased stress and pressure to certain higher education reforms. In the Germany, it's the consequence of the regulated bachelor system, whereas in Denmark, it's a reform from hell, referencing to so-called progress reform in Denmark. However, what's rather interesting is that when discussing possible solutions for these mental health struggles in the newspapers, the focus is very much shifted away from these structural problems, and in fact, and discuss more specific individualized solutions, what can be considered as various self-help methods. Discussions about yoga, spending time with puppies, suggestions of how to take control, and also strategies to overcome procrastination, as this example here from the German newspaper shows. So basically, in focusing on these self-help methods, very much the emphasis is shifted to the responsibility of the individual to take care of their problems. On the other hand, then we have, as contrast to these stressed and anxious students, we have this efficient and rational student. It's related to various discussions about student choices and the intensity of studying. Common across our many newspapers were this importance placed on this making right and informed choices, and particularly problematization of wrong choices. And often these right and informed choices were associated with the idea leading to good employment prospects in the future. So again, we have an example from the German newspaper where it says that record number of students at universities, but too little interest in technology, indicating that some students have made some wrong choices. And the other example is from the Danish newspaper, where it says that young people do not always think about what's going to happen in the future. And that's why adults have the responsibility to help students to choose that courses that do not make them unemployed. Again, very much focused on the employment. The other aspect here is that in the newspapers, it's kind of discussed that there is this desire for students to use time efficiently, or at least others have the desire that students should use their time efficiently, related to discussions about graduating within a given time frame, or also discussions about engaging with right activities while studying. And I think here the idea is very much on using the time efficiently and sort of maximizing the experiences at the university with the idea of being prepared again for the future labor market. So what I see here is this contradiction, again, established between these structural problems and this individualized ideal student. So basically, we have the news media where it highlights the systemic issues beyond students' control, which were these different, for example, financial pressures and higher education reforms that affect their mental well-being. But at the same time, these rather hegemonic discourses of efficiency, individualism, rationality are reproduced as desirable qualities of students, even when these discussing solutions to students' mental health struggles. So I think here in both, there is this underpinning this ideal student, which is constructed as rational, self-reliant, autonomous individual who navigates application in a timely and linear manner. I'm aware of the time, so I'm just going to speed up quite a bit. So the last one I want to show you is the contradictory construction of students as oversensitive snowflakes and students as threat for free speech. This is very much related to how students are discussed as political actors, specifically in the English and Irish newspapers, and it's related to particular forms of protest or political acts, such as safe spaces, trigger warnings, and no platforming. So first we have the oversensitive snowflake, which means that in discussing these forms of protest, students are discussed or described as immature, oversensitive, unable to cope with the real world, and lacking resilience. Here we have some examples where students are seen as mollycoddled. They are seen as generation snowflake, as seen in the Irish Independent example. And in the last one from The Guardian, it says that the safe space movement springs from lack of maturity in modern students, which is then contrasted with the previous generations that are considered to have more maturity than the current students. So what I see that happens here when describing students in this way, while they engage with these political or with these certain types of protest, is that their acts of political engagement are basically dismissed as mere expressions of emotional sensitivity, and also maybe some of their efforts to engage and initiate discussions that might be related to power and injustices are also discarded. However, at the same time, these students are seen as a threat to free speech. So basically, students engaging these forms of protest, they are accused of censorship and shutting down the open debate, as this example very well indicates, which is said that I argue that with this fixation of safe spaces and trigger warnings, that is helping to erode the traditional liberal ethos of our universities. In places of openness, there is internal policing of thoughts and words. Sadly, those old age principles and of challenge and debate are being replaced by new censors. So basically, these students are then seen as a threat also to the traditional ideals of academic debate and practices, as well as to the free speech. So I think that there is a bit of a tension here, or conflicting perspectives on students' political power. So constructing students as snowflakes and seeing their political activism as expressions of emotional sensitivity basically implies that they possess very little political power, while at the same time accusing them of free speech actually suggests that they hold substantial amount of power within the university. What is interesting, like a curiosity here, is that when looking at these media reports, it's rarely students' voices that are included in these reports. Instead, it's usually various authority figures that dominate this media commentary about students censoring and threat to free speech. So just a couple of concluding points, and I'm very sorry I went over time so much. So what I my aim here was to show that this discursive politics of studentships captures the complexity of the content and the contradictory ways in which the news media represents what it means to be a student. And this discursive politics of studentship also determine who is deemed as a legitimate student, what kind of activities are considered acceptable, and what expectations and values are placed on current and future students, which then obviously can have implications for the public perceptions, but also the students' everyday lives when they navigate this discursive space. One last point that I want to say, that what I hopefully have shown of media analysis within the higher education scholarship, then how it can enrich our understanding of the studentship in the contemporary society, and also the importance to further expand beyond what might be considered more traditional research areas in order to capture evolving understandings of students. Thank you. I'll stop now. Sorry about the timing.
Thanks so much, Anu. No need to apologize. We have just 2 presentations, so it was totally fine to go a little bit over. It was a really fascinating presentation. I've taken tons of notes. So I'm going to open the floor to questions. Let's see if anyone has questions. If not, I have a few to get started with. So Rachel has a question.
Sorry, Anu, we've talked about this a lot over the years. So yeah, I was just wondering, obviously you did your data collection quite a while ago now in 20 sort of, well, the extracts you showed were from sort of the 2015-16 time period. And I guess, you know, over in the recent past, when we look at media coverage, there have been some kind of news stories that have been discussed, like, for example, the Gaza protests, cost of living crisis in the UK, the financial crisis of universities and students perhaps being seen as sort of, you know, victims of that. I just wonder, and I know you haven't, well, you probably haven't done a kind of an academic study of kind of the recent press coverage, but do you see any kind of differences in, you know, over the past few years from the kind of period that you were looking at for your PhD?
Well, I would say that yes, probably there has been differences, and yeah, without having conducted like a new field study about the topic, but I would say that certain newspapers that perhaps were, especially in terms of this political activism, were perhaps quite critical about students and only portraying them in this very specific light in the past. I think that has developed actually quite a bit. And I think there is much more, I mean, not obviously in every newspaper, but in some there is much more nuance, I think, in the way these certain aspects or certain targets of protest perhaps are discussed. That would be my kind of initial feeling. But having said that, I would still say that I guess what I'm trying to also show here is that, well, I can't make a full argument, but I would still believe that this dynamic, these contradictions, they might be something different if I conducted this study with the more recent data. But I would still very much believe that this complexity that is still there. But the topics, obviously, what are kind of contradicted might be different in itself.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's I was actually thinking about the articles about the Gaza-related protests, and that Rachel mentioned now, and there were definitely those contradictions, right, of them being sort of terrorists and causing problems, but at the same time somehow ignorant. So I think that's bang on that those contradictions stay, even though the topic may be different. We have a question or a message from Donna Smith, who says that she can't unmute, but she thinks it's a fantastic and important project. And she applauds you on being able to spend your PhD reading Daily Mail articles and not having your blood pressure rise too much. Good point, Donna. Kind of related to that, Obviously, I'm a little bit familiar with the Euro Students Project, and I know that the newspapers you chose in each country, some were more aligned with the Daily Mail and some were more aligned with, say, the Guardian for a UK audience. And I was wondering if there were differences in the way students were portrayed based on the leaning of the newspaper.
Overall, yes, I would say. And I mean, in my thesis, I also obviously discussed this data in various other manners than well, actually, I don't even discuss it so much in the way I presented it now in the end. But yes, I would say that yeah, there are differences. To some extent, in terms of like what is discussed, so the topic itself, but I think oftentimes it's also could be about the nuances and what aspects of a topic is highlighted and what is not so much, and obviously how students are seen in relation to these topics. So yeah, I would say so. But interestingly enough, I don't think there was like a clear pattern in the sense that like all tabloid papers would be equally sort of what's the word, sort of disturbing maybe. In the sense that, for example, the tabloid from Denmark was much more kind of closer in its reporting to the project paper in Denmark. If I compare, for example, the two English newspapers, where there was a much starker difference in terms of how students were discussed.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's actually quite interesting that it wasn't that stark.
Yeah, I think it is indeed.
Any other questions? I guess I have another one. So you kind of presented these themes as appearing across all the newspapers in the 6 countries, right?
Yeah.
And I was wondering if there were certain themes that were sort of overrepresented in the newspapers of one country and sort of less represented, or did you find them quite uniformly across all?
Well, yeah, basically with these particular contradictions that I wanted to present here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I actually forgot to mention in every phase that to what extent they were presented in each country. And I think this is something what I still need to think about myself when drafting this presentation, the paper format. So how to deal with this, with these possible, not maybe similarities and differences, but sort of the tensions and things like that. Because yeah, I mean, I'm not focusing in presenting these findings in so much about how it is in one country, how it is in other countries. What I'm kind of trying to capture here is something more about the certain logic in how this media space in relation when constructing the studentship kind of functions. But I think considering that this still draws from a study that had 6 countries, I think that's something that I will need to kind of deal with somehow, what to do with that. And in these particular 3 constructions that I focused on today, what's interesting that the Spanish newspapers doesn't actually fit to any of these constructions, any of these contradictions. There were a few others, but obviously I tried to show something that is present in more than one country only. So I mean, I guess that's something perhaps could be one potential comparative point of view to look at in terms of like what kind of contradictions are presented and where, but we'll see.
I mean, I'm kind of curious if you could tell us a little, like quite briefly, about why the Spanish case didn't fit, in what sense?
Well, I mean, it's not to say that there were not any contradictions in the Spanish media, but I think the themes that some of these constructions that I discussed here reflects oftentimes where, well, not all the time, but sometimes where more slightly differently discussed in Spain. I think overall, with exceptions of couple topics, Spain oftentimes were much more sort of friendly, if that's the word to use, in the way students were discussed, or the student-related topics were reported. And there was quite a lot of also sort of, how would I say it? Quite a lot of sort of reporting that you could say that kind of were more on the student side rather than kind of criticizing them. In compared to some other countries, much more, I would say that. I'm not really sure why is that, but that's how it is in a few cases.
Interesting. Any other questions or even reflections? No. Okay, so since we have just 2 papers, we could also, if there are no, I mean, if there are other questions also for Xiaohan, you could ask. But if there are no other questions, we could also end a little bit early, given that we have just 2 presenters this session. So last call for questions for either presenters. Okay, so in that case, I think we can call it an end to the session. Many thanks to both Xiaohan and Anu for really fascinating presentations, which has really given us a lot to think about. Thanks to everyone who asked questions, for the kind of engaging discussion we've had. And as always, a huge thanks to Alex for the IT support. And I wish all those who are attending the in-person element of the conference a very good rest of your conference. And for those who are attending just today, I hope it was a good session, and I'll see you at the closing remarks. All right. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.